Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to completely unpack the deep historical roots, the incredibly complex legal battles, and the modern economic drivers behind the Balochistan conflict. And we're doing this using the detailed accounts from our source material. This is a region that's currently experiencing a severe crisis, one that a lot of experts say threatens the very survival of the state it's in. Yet, somehow, its story is almost always buried under political noise and media silence. So today, we're going to cut through all of that. We're looking strictly at the facts, the history, and the data to figure out exactly what is happening in this highly volatile region.
To truly understand this region, we're going to cover a few key areas. First, the current crisis. Second, the roots of the Kalat state. Third, the 1947 accession controversy. Fourth, decades of armed insurgency. And finally, number 5, CPEC and the modern conflict. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The current crisis.
To really grasp the severity of what's happening right now, we have to look at a dramatic recent event detailed in our source material. Picture this, March 11, 2025. Armed insurgents targeted the Jafar Express train traveling from Quetta to Peshawar. They used an 8-kilogram improvised explosive device planted right on the tracks near the Balon Pass and derailed the train. And keep in mind, this train was carrying 450 passengers. After separating the women, children, and locals, the insurgents essentially hijacked the train, taking hostages and demanding the release of political prisoners within 48 hours. And when those demands absolutely weren't met, well, a massive military operation kicked off, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides.
Now, this huge escalation shows exactly how the conflict has shifted from isolated, hit-and-run guerrilla warfare into what honestly resembles two conventional armies fighting. We're seeing a massive consolidation of power here. Over the last few years, fragmented fighter groups basically realized that, divided, they were failing. So what did they do? They unified under umbrellas like the BNA or the Baloch National Army. To put that into perspective, in just a single year, they carried out 72 coordinated attacks against state forces. That's not just a random uprising. That is a highly organized, lethal force operating with a clear, singular objective of total independence.
Moving on to Section 2, the roots of the Kalat state. To grasp why these groups are demanding independence today, we really have to rewind and see how this region's unique identity was formed over centuries. It's fascinating because this area began as a simple tribal alliance. Way back in the 12th century, there were no real borders, just scattered tribes. Then, a leader named Mir Jalal Khan stepped up and brought 44 of these tribes together into a mutual defense alliance, literally laying the very first foundation for a unified Baloch identity. By 1666, trying to protect themselves from the massive Safavid and Mughal empires next door, the tribes established a central authority and appointed Mir Ahmad Khan as the very first Khan of Kalat. Fast forward to 1839. The British Empire, playing the whole great game against Russia, needed a buffer zone to stop Russian expansion into India. So they attacked the state to secure military routes into Afghanistan. This fundamentally altered the region's trajectory and eventually led to the signing of the absolutely crucial Treaty of Kalat in 1876.
So the really critical point to understand here is that the British never actually fully colonized the entire area. Our source notes that they just weren't interested in committing the vast resources needed to occupy such a rugged, massive territory. Instead, they sliced it up. They directly controlled strategic military and trade zones, which they basically leased and called British Balochistan. But the much larger surrounding area, the Khanate of Kalat, was ruled indirectly. The Khan handled the day-to-day internal matters through a tribal council, while the British managed foreign policy and tossed the Khan an annual subsidy. You can probably see where this is going. This setup created an incredibly messy legal precedent for what would happen when the British finally packed up and left.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 1947 accession controversy. When the British finally prepared to leave the subcontinent, a massive question mark hung over the Khanate of Kalat. The Khan of Kalat at the time strongly believed his state should revert to full independence. And get this, he actually hired none other than Muhammad Ali Jinnah, yes, the future founder of Pakistan, as his legal advisor. It's quite a twist. Jinnah argued brilliantly on the Khan's behalf, pointing straight to Article 3 of that 1876 Treaty of Kalat. He used it to prove to the British cabinet that Kalat was actually never formally a part of the British Empire. Instead, it was a sovereign state bound only by a treaty, and therefore it should become its own independent country upon their departure.
What followed was an absolutely intense sequence of political maneuvering. In June 1947, a British-appointed council voted to hand over the least British Balochistan territory to the newly forming Pakistan. But the Khanate of Kalat was a completely different story. On August 4, 1947, a standstill agreement was actually signed where Pakistan officially recognized Kalat's independence. It seems settled, right? Well, the geopolitical winds shifted fast. The British, who were terrified that a weak, independent Kalat might fall under Soviet influence, suddenly declared it unfit for international responsibilities. At the same time, Pakistan systematically isolated Kalat by striking separate, quiet deals with surrounding tribal leaders. Finally, in March 1948, the Pakistani military, backed by naval destroyers, actually surrounded Kalat, leaving the Khan with no choice but to sign the accession document.
Section 4. Decades of armed insurgency.
That forced accession in 1948 was the spark. It immediately triggered an insurgency that has basically recurred in a tragic, cyclical pattern for decades now. You see, the resentment wasn't just political anymore, it became deeply personal. According to the source, a devastating cycle kicked off. Immediately after the 1948 accession, the Khan's own brother Prince Abdul Karim launched a guerrilla war straight from the mountains. Eventually, the state offered peace, swearing on the Quran that if the rebels surrendered, they would be completely forgiven. But the moment they came down from the mountains, they were immediately arrested and jailed. And this exact same betrayal happened again in 1958 with an 80-year-old leader named Nawab Nowruz Khan. He surrendered under a Quranic oath, only to watch his sons be executed while he was thrown in prison. According to the source material, this fundamentally shattered any remaining trust and deeply entrenched a historical narrative of betrayal that literally fuels fighters to this very day.
And these localized rebellions? Well, they were further inflamed by aggressive political centralization. Take 1955, for example. The one-unit policy was implemented, which literally attempted to erase the name Balochistan right off the map. The entire goal was to create a single West Pakistan identity to counter East Pakistan, which of course is today Bangladesh. For the local population, this meant their distinct history, their culture, and their political representation were just dissolved. It effectively turned them into second-class citizens governed entirely from the Punjab province. And even after this policy finally ended, brutal military crackdowns just kept continuing throughout the 1970s.
Finally, Section 5. CPEC and the Modern Conflict.
Let's examine how modern economic exploitation has really acted as the ultimate catalyst for today's hyper-militarized environment. Think of it this way. If history lit the match, the modern economy poured a gallon of fuel on the fire. When a massive 42 million tons of gold and copper reserves were discovered in the Chagai district, it should have brought absolute immense wealth to the locals. But it didn't. According to the source, the extraction contracts were structured in a way that just left locals stunned. China took 50% of the profits, the central government in Pakistan took 48%, and the local province of Balochistan, they received a mere 2%. Just 2% of the wealth from their own land.
Furthermore, we absolutely have to talk about the staggering $60 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. This was a massive infrastructure initiative that was publicly promised to turn the coastal region into a booming economic hub. Politicians were literally comparing it to a brand new Dubai. But the reality on the grounds turned out to be starkly different. The projects completely excluded local populations from both the decision-making process and the resulting wealth.
These massive projects created incredibly intense local grievances. Imagine this. Locals were being forced to sell their land at rock-bottom prices. And instead of creating jobs for the local population like they promised, there was this massive influx of foreign Chinese engineers and workers from the Punjab province. Then, to protect those new investments, permanent military settlements were established right in their backyards. In coastal places like Gwadar, generations of local fishermen were just pushed out, losing their absolute only source of livelihood. The sheer economic marginalization was the tipping point. It's exactly what prompted various militant groups to stop fighting alone, form unified fronts, and start directly targeting foreign economic infrastructure.
So, considering the centuries of tribal history, the disputed treaties, and the intense modern economic grievances we've explored in this explainer today, we really have to ask ourselves, how long can this cycle of violence continue before the region hits an absolute breaking point? With foreign powers hovering and an insurgency now operating with the sheer sophistication of a modern army, the stakes have literally never been higher. Will a central state just continue to rely on overwhelming military crackdowns, or is there still a tiny narrow window left for genuine political dialogue and economic equity? Ultimately, that is the question that will define the survival of the region. Thank you so much for exploring this highly complex issue with me today.